Design is magic. I see design everywhere, and I believe everybody is a designer. That doesn't mean they're a professional designer, but I mean design as a mindset, skill set of practices of agency, of bringing new things to the world. If you make decisions that affect other people, you're a designer. Then it's your responsibility to know about what kind of impact you want to have, what kind of value you want to create, so you can make a choice to help trigger that response. And every day I get up with a mission to help infuse that into more people's mindsets. I'm helped to unleash their agency in a world that's filled with more complexity and uncertainty.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. This episode is a part of what's turning into a series on large systems change, which is something that we all need to understand if we want to transform work. I find the practitioners of large-scale change to be, on the one hand, daunted by the task, and yet they still find ways to keep pursuing a better future with all their might. It's a beautiful combination, and they design for it, not just hope for it or react to it, but they intentionally shape it. That's what today's guest, Lisa K. Solomon, has spent her career helping leaders to do. Lisa designs environments, experiences, and classes to help people expand their futures, adapt to complexities, and build civic followership. She teaches at the Stanford d.school and has written extensively about the intersection of design, foresight, and large-scale change. In this episode, Lisa and I talk about how to lead with imagination in uncertain times, why good strategy needs emotional engagement, and how design can be a form of applied hope. We also explore what leaders can learn from scenario planning, the surprising lessons of an early GNC wellness experiment, and how future readiness starts with asking better questions. All right, if you enjoy this episode, don't forget to subscribe. Now, here's my conversation with Lisa K. Solomon. Lisa K. Solomon, welcome to Work for Humans.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. Thrilled to be here.
Your work is overlapping a lot of threads that we've been pursuing on the show. And I don't know exactly the order in which we're going to unravel those threads today.
That makes it fun, doesn't it?
I know. So it's going to be very dynamic. One of the threads is the thread of how to create large system change. And one of the threads that we follow a lot on the show is design and design practices. Another thread we've been following in the show is experience design and transformation design. And so you've written a number of works and you've been consulting for years on this intersection between design and strategy and change. And so we recently got connected because of your recent HBR article, which is Pandemic Era Lessons on Leading Through Drastic Change. But I think we're going to talk about a lot more than that in today's conversation.
Well, I'm thrilled about all of those threads that you identified. Yes, I fundamentally believe that design is at the core of everything. I recently had an opportunity to teach some master's students in our grad program at Stanford, where I lecture and teach and have been doing that for 7+ years. And I opened up the talk and I said, design is magic. Design is magic. I think so. And I'm a self-taught designer. I hold multiple degrees, none of them in design, but design has been the core thread of my entire life. And sometimes I say to people, particularly people that are not as familiar with design, that I'm a little bit like that kid in The Sixth Sense. If you remember that movie, that famous movie with Willis, where he says, poor kid says, I see dead people everywhere. I see design everywhere, Dart. I see design everywhere. And I believe everybody is a designer. That doesn't mean they're a professional designer and they know how to make great products or graphic designers, but I mean design as a mindset, skill set of practices of agency, of bringing new things to the world. I often say to people that are skeptics or that are new to that concept that they're a designer, if you make decisions that affect other people, and I imagine that's everybody listening to your podcast, you're a designer. So then it's your responsibility, we could talk more about this, to know about what kind of impact you want to have, what kind of value you want to create, so you can make a choice to help trigger that response. So there's a lot to unpack in there, but I believe that design is the core of everything. And in many ways, every day I get up with a mission to help infuse that into more people's mindsets. I'm not there to teach them frontally, but I'm helped to unleash their agency in a world that's filled with more complexity and uncertainty.
And one of the places where you've applied design that is new to me is design as a strategic tool. And so let's start there, which is if I'm a leader and I am facing uncertainty, I'm facing the need to bring my company toward a strategic alignment, how does design play into that moment?
I love that question, Dart. Wait, so about 10 years ago, I wrote a book about designing strategic conversations. It was called Moments of Impact, and I co-authored it with a fellow scenario planner, a fellow designer of strategic conversations named Chris Ertel. And the premise of the book, and in fact, the opening chapter was that the ability to design strategic conversations, meaning not strategic meetings, not strategic presentations or monologues, but conversations meant to elicit new ideas, meant to share information, meant to recombine. The ability to design those conversations about high impact, high value challenges and opportunities is the most important leadership skill we've never been taught. That's the opening chapter. This is the most important leadership skill you've never been taught. Why? Because fundamentally, design is a process of discovery and of experimentation. And there's lots of ways to apply that, whether you apply it to the actual conversation you're having, right? So you have to really interrogate, like, what kind of conversation do we need? Do we need a conversation that's about building understanding of the changing context? Do we need a conversation that's about shaping options? Do we need a conversation about making decisions? These are different kinds of conversations and therefore should be designed differently. And then you could think about, well, how do I want to get the best out of people that are going to be a part of the conversation? A lot of times people think that, hey, we need to have a strategic conversation. Let's just get it on people's calendars and facilitated pixie dust will happen. No, no. The choices are made well in advance about how are you framing the question? Who is even in the room? How is the room set up? We often have a high stakes strategic conversation or issue we need to tackle. And so we reserve the boardroom, just as an example, Dart, the boardroom, because that connotes seriousness. Well, if you think about a typical boardroom, they're filled with a big oak table, big leather chairs. There's no windows because you need privacy. And we forget that when people walk into a room like that, their sensory overload is around status and importance and threat and imposter syndrome. And so what happens is that we shrink and our energy contracts and we get into a defensive mode, which is the exact wrong stance of how you want people to show up when you need them to be generative and creative and expansive and curious. So it feels counterintuitive, but imagine inviting people to a room that had open windows, that had things to write things on, that had whiteboards that allowed for the democratization of ideas, right? So all of these are choices. They're design choices you make in advance. And then the final thing I'll say, particularly as it relates to strategy, is we tend to be very analytical about strategy. We are not analytical beings. We have that as part of it. We're emotional beings. So a big part of the book, Moments of Impact, around designing conversations is about inviting productive emotion into the room because we know that experiences move us. They move us to that transformation. I have yet to find, maybe Dart, you know people, but I've yet to find people that are transformed because they saw an Excel spreadsheet with numbers. They can be, oh, maybe they're intrigued a little, but that comes from a holistic experience. So we fundamentally believe that strategy, that leaders that are having to create strategy in a world filled with more volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity need to think more like designers with that discovery and experimentation mindset than like what we say in the book, mechanics, where you're looking for best practices or blueprints. Because best practices don't exist for the future, not really. I mean, that doesn't mean we can't take heuristics that we know that we want or values that we want to carry forward. But we're facing increasingly novel adaptive challenges that we don't have precedent for.
There were two things in that, and I experienced this when I was reading the book too, which was there's two ways in which design is being applied in strategic conversations. One is the design of the conversation. And the second thing is strategy as a design problem. And those are both true. It's almost like there's the small design problem, which is the conversations,
Yes.
that are in service of a larger design problem, which is strategy.
Yes.
And you mentioned scenarios. And one of the things I didn't understand is that a lot of the book is about uncertainty. And scenario planning assumes I can guess the future. In other words, it seems to me that, let me say it this way, a lot of what's magic about design is that we can rapidly iterate toward a better solution. Scenario planning, in my experience, is about saying, what are the things that could happen to us in 5 years? And I'm trying to resolve the timescales in my head between scenario planning and design practices.
I love that. Great question. Maybe I'll add a little, but we're learning together. I would say futures thinking, of which scenario planning is a practice of, helps you explore how the future might unfold and why. So I don't think of scenario planning as actually projections of the future. I think of them as articulations of possible futures that are informed by unfolding trends of today. That's what makes it a little different than, say, speculative fiction, which is also often on little bits and pieces. But when scenarios are done well, they're extrapolations of uncertainties that are unfolding, and they're brought together in vignettes that allow you to visit a possible future. It's certainly not a guarantee. So taking a step back, so futures thinking, of which scenario planning is one, helps you explore how the future might unfold and why. Design gives you agency to build towards your preferred future, to then say, wow, if the world is going to change this way, how do I discover what people or the planet might need in that world to inform decisions that I might make today in order to give us the best chance towards creating the world that we want to be in, or at the very least, creating strategies that help inoculate us against the worst of how that world might unfold. So what it does is a practice. And I also want to say, and listen, scenario planners like me, folks that have some experience in strategic foresight, we got very popular in the March of 2020. Sea change, of course, because everybody wanted to understand how this disruptive, global, novel virus was going to change the world we lived in. Nobody had any answers. Totally knew the world. Now, we and great scenario planners, of course, learned from history. We could look to the avian flu epidemic and, of course, the Spanish flu and others to understand, but it was a different world, right? So that could inform our strategy, but that was not going to be enough. So we started to see, I still haven't done the Google search around trended searching in 2020. How does this end or what's going to happen? But those of us that had skill sets in taking macro uncertainties, using them in both creative and critical thinking ways to identify how the world might unfold was all of a sudden a very high demand skill set and set of inputs into how leaders were making decisions at that time. So the great news is I think a lot more people are comfortable with these practices and they're talking about it. The design piece, though, that you pull out, I think is so critical because scenarios on their whole, and now you can just search, like, give me scenarios for X, Y, Z. They don't do anything for you. The question is what you're going to do with it. What's the integration of a scenaric thinking process, scenarios that somebody else created to help inform how you might make a different decision today? And of course, that's going to be different for every leader. But I think this is a really, really important distinction, particularly as the futures world, the strategic foresight world continues, corporate foresight to take off, is that won't do the strategy for you. The strategy is in the conversations and in the integration. And maybe getting back to part of your core question, why is strategy design or what can design offer strategy? Design is, I think, a practice that allows us to continue to learn. And anyone that thinks right now in this world that we're in, that if you just do the strategic planning process, whether you do it internally or you hire a consultant and you have a 3 to 5 year strategic plan, and that's the way it's going to be, sets themselves up to be woefully blindsided and vulnerable. That's just not the way it works anymore. And that was, by the way, one of the core points of the HBR article that you mentioned is that one key lesson from COVID was that leaders need to proactively engage with uncertainty.
Yeah, that was a very interesting part of it. A part of what's coming to mind for me is the idea of having how might we statements. And the how might we statement is how might we blank if
Yes.
scenario. And then getting a sense of the range of scenarios that the how might we if might need to apply to.
Yes. And I'll even turn that in the other way. I have a mixed reaction with how might we statements. We can get there.
Please, I'd like to know.
But I would say what I like to do, because I really, more than anything, Dart, in my work, whether I'm working with my students or leaders, I try to make it accessible. I try to reduce the gap between this jargonish thing called like futures and futures thinking to be like, hey, how can we all be better prepared for an increasingly uncertain world? How can I unleash agency in you to shape the future you want to be a part of, to at the very least not be without options? I've yet to meet a group of people and I say, who wants to have the future happen to them? That is not what we want. But to go back to the how might be, what I often say in a kind of distilled visiting of the future is to just do like a Mad Lib. In a world filled with blank and blank, external, right? And not in a world filled where we make our numbers. No, that's internal. So many of strategy processes are internal, right? The SWOT analysis is a great example. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. From where we stand today. The future doesn't care about where you stand today. The future's filled with all this uncertainty and surprise, right? Which is why we need to have an outside in perspective. And we could talk about different ways of doing that. So I like to use the Mad Lib when I'm trying to introduce people. In a world filled with blank and blank, blank, a person that we're designing for, a group that needs a way to blank in order to blank. So
Beautiful.
That allows us to combine this, what's happening in the external world, how might it unfold, and how do I make choices to create value for people that are going to be impacted by that world? And I can give you more concrete examples, but very quickly, we did a rapid fire scenario planning exercise shortly after COVID really took over in March of 2020 to help even understand how we as a department within the university was going to respond. And I think that really helped clarify for a lot of my colleagues the importance of this work, not just in a crisis, but in an ongoing way.
I like what you just did with that, which is that to the extent that design is about solving jobs to be done or problems that people have, knowing that the problems they have is a changing landscape is what you are designing toward. So it's not anchored on what do we want the company to be, it's what is the problem, what is the context that the people who we provide value to is going to be in potentially in the future.
And I think what I love about design and the way I think about design is that it's a wide range of practices. It's not any one thing. It's not any one process. But at its core, design is steeped in empathy, right? Design is steeped in having humility if you are going to be responsible for trying to create choices that create value for others, is not imposing what you think is valuable on others, right? It's to do that deep observation work, that questioning work, that insight work that is nuanced and should not be fast-tracked and definitely should not be outsourced to ChatGPT. This ability to get proximate with people and to try to understand, as you said, how their needs, their desires, what will help them thrive will change in a changing context. So you're adding, again, these wonderful approaches from these practices of strategic foresight or futures thinking in design in a blended way that allows you to have a longer lens in thinking about design, right? In thinking about the choices. The shorthand of that, maybe I could de-jargon it a bit, is Roman Krasnarik's work on being a good ancestor. How do we have a longer lens on the choices that we're making and have empathy for people that are not even here yet, for future generations to come?
One of the things you say in Moments of Impact, the book, is the need to intentionally promote extreme collaboration. I can think of two reasons why that is. One is the more perspectives you get, the more likely you are to get to the right strategy. But the second reason is that everybody gets to the strategy together. And so it's got a change component to it. Is that all of it? The reason I ask is I'm going to tell you where I'm going to take the conversation, which is a lot of the people who listen to this show are thinking about how to transform work so that work is recognized as a product and employees are recognized as customers and all of the things that follow on from that. This is a large systems change. It's companies have a self-reinforcing system that reproduces the system. And that system is one that sees people in the organization as inputs to be acquired and managed. So a lot of us listening to the show and to me, we're on this edge of a change that we want to lead. And listening to you, that change should be led by design.
Well, it should be led by humans, for sure. And again, when design is done well, it has empathy and care for humans. There's a lot of different responses to those wonderful observations. One I would say is, well, you're reminding me, Dar, when I first started really understanding the power of design, this is over 20 years ago. Again, I was always doing design, I didn't have a language for it. And I got really lucky in the early 90s to work with an innovation design strategy firm. We didn't call ourselves that. We called ourselves marketing because people understood that language. We said, oh, we want to grow, and we want to grow by understanding what customers want. So we're going to watch what customers want, and we're going to make choices that way versus paying a whole lot of money for a proxy of what they wanted through a research report that people did through surveys, which were wildly off because they didn't actually have close contact with customers. So I did a lot of that work early on. I later came to understand that as design work and did some fun projects with folks like Dunkin' Donuts, which we should talk about because who doesn't want to talk about donuts? But the first book that I was going to write, which is where I'm going with this, because if you really watch how companies treat their customers, the people that keep them in business, and I think the point you're making, how they treat their employees, it's as if they hate them. I was going to write a book called We Hate Our Customers because it's how they operate. And I think all of us can have that experience in some way. I'll give you one, which is when I came up with the idea for the book. I was living on the East Coast and I was traveling from my hometown of Philadelphia to where I was living at the time, New York, on the Amtrak train. And I just wanted to get back in New York. Like, here's a human, just wants to get back to New York. So I hopped on the train that I could. It was the Metroliner, even though I had a ticket for another train. And the conductor comes around and they're like, oh, you're on the wrong train. You're going to have to get off at Metro Park. I was like, I don't want to get off at Metro Park. I want to get to New York. Sorry, can I give you more money? I get it. I have the wrong ticket. Let me give you more money so I can do what I want and get to where I need to go. And the conductor was like, we can't help you there. You have to get off. You have to get off. We have no way of taking more money. And you, the customer that keeps us in business, violated something because we had systems that do not allow you to do what you want to do. And so next thing you know, Metro Park, and now I waste this precious little time I have on my weekend to get back, blah, blah, blah. And then the gall of it all is when I finally did get to Penn Station, I'm going up the elevator, the escalator, and I hear over the loudspeaker, we at Amtrak care about our customers.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt like, no, you don't. You actually don't. So if you look at it through that lens, and you look at it through the lens of like, what choices are people making that then ultimately become systems? Systems are just ingrained choices done over time, often with incentivized outcomes. They're often not based on what humans want and need. They are serving a different outcome. So I fundamentally believe start with understanding what humans want and need and connect it to choices that you can make to make it easier for them. And then you create systems around it, but that you also ideally have those systems be pliable, that they can learn, that if they're not getting to the outcome that you want, that you can change them, that you have the wherewithal to observe. Take my Amtrak example. Where did it break down? If you look at one of design's greatest tools, like a journey map, right, which really maps different stages in a service, a process, an experience, and you try to get what would create someone value or joy and what brings them friction or pain, you could have mapped that. And then you could have an intervention. Oh, I don't know, let's give the conductor the ability to get more money. And then when people say, oh, but that would be too problematic, you could say, well, listen, Apple stores figured that out. They noticed, one of the companies that put design on the map, they noticed when they first started their retail stores in the 2000s that they created this amazing space where people wanted to go. But then they had a bottleneck problem in the old cashier, the inherited system of you need to check out at a cashier. Well, they would get these huge queues that fell in the face of the kind of experience they were trying to create. So what did they do? They said, what if? Maybe this is where how might we question, like, how might we reduce the line or whatever? If that gets you to an expansive point of view that says, what if we give everybody that works there the ability to take people's money? Because guess what? The ability to take people's money is what enables us to stay in business. Whoa, that's a game changer. Then you orient systems around that. But that could never happen because that's a block. That's a let me protect the status quo. That's not how designers think. Well, it's not how most designers think.
I've been very interested in systems that are designed by people and architectures that are designed by people but not for people. And what are they really designed for? So that was exactly the kind of story that I think of when I think about systems designed by but not for people.
I learned to define design, this work that I was doing when I did a case study that ended up in Joseph Pine's book, The Experience Economy, this early 90s work. I read a book that just changed my world and my vocabulary of how to describe what I did and what I loved. And that book was from Don Norman, and it was The Design of Everyday Things. And in that book, that was this huge light bulb moment for me, where he describes design as delivering functional utility and affordances and all those things. And then ultimately, he later wrote a book about emotional engagement. So for me, when I think about what is a designer's responsibility, it is to create functional utility and emotional engagement. Now, those two things are just category headers. A conversation has functional utility and emotional engagement. The things we use in our house every day has those two elements. So when I think about the story of Amtrak, okay, there was probably some functional utility of not giving the conductor the ability. Maybe they were worried about theft or blah, blah, blah. But like, what was the cost of the emotional engagement? So a lot of times when I'm trying to describe design to leaders that don't think of themselves as designers, right? I break it down. I said, tell me something that you love in your life that you would call well-designed. Anything, anything. And inevitably they say things like, oh, well, my car. Oh, great. Why? Well, it gets me places and has a placeholder and blah, 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 blah. Someone else will say, oh, my Dyson vacuum cleaner. I'm like, oh, yeah. Well, what makes it this thing that picks up dirt under your couch you love? Like you're willing to pay more money for it. Why? Because it does the thing you want it to do. And it does it in a way that feels like magic. It's quiet. It doesn't have a bag. Oh my gosh, it works every time. Or even going back to Apple. How many people here still have Apple packaging? Oh, I do. Why? Because it's beautiful. We don't even have the product anymore. We have the packaging, right? They have taken design to the ultimate level. And then I'll share a picture that I think everybody can relate to of a woman trying to open up a package, a big clamshell plastic package that has a light bulb in it. And you can see from her expression, she's mad. She is frustrated. She wants to get at that light bulb, and this packaging will not allow her to get to the light bulb. And that to me, Dart, is the metaphor for why we need design to be universal within organizations, because that product, that light bulb was probably beautifully designed, right? At this point, it's environmentally friendly. It's using better materials. It was pretty to look at. It's one of these newer ones. It probably does the thing she needs it to do, which is light her room. But the design memo did not get to the packaging people. They had a different memo. They had a memo that was, hey, let's make sure that when it ships from the manufacturing to the store where it's sold, it doesn't break or it stacks in the boxes, or you can punch a hole in it that's sturdy enough and you can put it on the thing. And none of that actually makes them money. It's the customer. So you look at that customer, this is a pissed off customer. They're not net promoter score 9+. And I just think what a missed opportunity. And if we can allow ourselves a wider range of thinking about how can we all align to make choices that will enable our company to serve the people we want to serve. And along the way, we could also define that the people that are working in the warehouse, they're also customers, right? I'm not saying ignore them, but it just allows for a much wider way of thinking about how do we create value at every step.
On Work for Humans, we've been exploring the principles of multi-sided management, which is the belief that work is a product that every company designs, builds, and delivers to employees. Along the way, people started asking how they could put these ideas into practice. So I founded the work design firm 11fold to help your company create the kind of work that makes teams feel alive and engaged instead of dead and dull. So you can reduce turnover and build commitment. We're doing something revolutionary here. Learn more at 11fold.com. That's 11fold.com. Can you describe the project that was referenced in Joe Pine's book, The Experience Economy?
Yes.
What it was and how it came to be?
I mean, it was one of my foundational design projects. So I worked with a firm called New Paradigm Ventures with a brilliant man named Rich Rakowski, who I think is mentioned, both of those may be mentioned by name. And we were working with General Nutrition Centers at the time, GNC. And this was the early 90s, and there was a GNC in every mall. But at the time, people went into GNC like a laser to get their protein powder, bee pollen. I'm just taking easy numbers here. If 10,000 people went into the mall a day, I would say at the time, this was how we were thinking about it. 8,000 would wander into the Discovery stores at the time and browse and look around. 100 of those 10,000 would go into GNC to go and get the thing. This was the time of like Joe Piscopo bodybuilding. We weren't yet into the wellness era, but our research, because we were actually talking to human beings, helped us understand that, let's go back to those 10,000 number of the day, probably 9,999 of them wanted to feel better in their life. So the first insight was GNC didn't just have to be about nutrition supplements and protein powder. It could be about wellness. And then adding on a layer, how might we invite people to explore what wellness meant to them and how they could get personalized products and services based on their needs? So I would go in there and I would say, I'm a 20-something, I'm living alone, I travel a lot and whatever. And we actually created a customized profiling experience that would then come up with a personalized vitamin regimen just for me and my needs that you could get filled right there. So instead of going in, bottle on the shelf, I know we are empowering through an experience the customers to go and learn about themselves and get highly personalized recommendations. For Lisa K, take once a day and then have an automatic refill. So the experience itself was different and the product itself was personalized. And we didn't just do it for their nutritional supplements. We experimented with health and beauty aids. So imagine, again, I would say, hey, this is the quality of my hair. This is how often I shampoo. This is the texture. And this is the smells I like. It would customize the shampoo and conditioner for me. This was so revolutionary, Dart, I can't even begin to tell you. There was no machinery available, no software, barely basic programming. We had to modify a paint mixer. Like when you go into a hardware store and you want a certain Pantone and they mix it for you, we had to modify one of those in order to create health and beauty additives like jojoba or whatever. Anyway, we built a prototype store in the Ultima, I think it was Ultima Mall in Orlando. It was called the Alive Store. And that's what's profiled in the book. And it was, wow, was it ahead of its time in so many ways. And it was a huge learning lesson for me. It was wildly creative. It was so exciting. We knew we were on the cutting edge, but the challenge was, frankly, at the time, it's just too expensive. It was too expensive, too hard to maintain. It required from a systems level, right, that the people that worked in the store knew how to fix the machines and work the machines. And fast forward to today, we're seeing all kinds of personalized wellness. We're seeing all kinds of personalized health and beauty aids. But that was really just an absolute learning on the frontier about trying to understand how to be on the edge of bringing the future to life. And frankly, some of the risks associated with that too.
Do you remember which book it was in? Was it in the Experience Economy that it was mentioned?
Yes.
It's interesting because in later editions of that book, he extended the model to include the transformation economy. And the truth is, people are going to GNC to buy a transformation. And the transformation may be, I want more muscles or I want my hair to be different. But they have to pass through an experience, a designed experience on their way toward that. And this is common, right? These things build upon each other. It's a really nice example of a lot of things that Joe Pine has written about, also mass customization, which is now we need to customize essentially the interface to our products. We need to customize it in such a way that people can find their unique transformation that they're looking for, that's uniquely theirs, and we need to make it easy.
But that's the big one. That's the hard one, and we need to make it easy. And, if we want to be sustainable, we need to design a business model that allows for that. And you had asked earlier about design and strategy. Another sort of later discovery that I made that I think allows for that experimentation on the business model side of the strategy came from Alex Osterwalder's work in business model generation. It's probably 20 years now, maybe 17, he took a dissertation that he did with his professor, Yves Pignor, about visualizing business models. So he had a brilliant insight, which was why do we ask people to write essentially very lengthy fiction plans of how their business plan, how their idea might unfold in paragraphs and all this stuff, when it's really about testing out contingencies and prototyping hypotheses we have about our value proposition and our customer segments and how we're going to serve them and how we're going to make money and the kinds of relationships we're going to build. Those are all, they got to work together. And on the back end, the kind of activities we would do, the resources we would do, the partners we might have, and the costs. And he created a visual canvas blueprint for people to experiment with that in a very rapid form way. And he was inspired by architects. He's like, look, architects don't write 100-page theses of the kind of buildings they're going to create. They sketch it out. So we should do the same with business models. And I bring that up only because now we are at this interesting point where when I first did that project with GNC, everything had to be customized. Everything had to be created from scratch. Now technology has allowed backends and platforms and ways of thinking about it. It doesn't mean it's easy, but it actually means you have to have clarity around what your unique advantage is in serving that need and how you're going to back it up in a way that's also feasible and viable. We talk about design sometimes as being the sort of Venn diagram of understanding the problem you're trying to solve for humans or people. It doesn't have to be humans. I mean, it's a huge pet market. There's people in the sustainability business, but understanding who you're designing for, who or what you're designing for, and if it's really serving a need, right? That would be the desirability category. There's a whole other category around feasibility. Okay, so you've identified something. Can you actually build it? And then there's the third around viability. Is it sustainable? And we're arguing, and a lot of work that we've been doing at the D.school lately is around ethics. Is it ethical? Just because you can build it, should you build it? And how do you get ahead of second and third order consequences and in order to be responsible? Because now we're not just designing with materials that are hardware and software, we're designing with algorithms. We're designing with synthetic biology. We're designing with living systems. Wow. We really have to get ahead of some models to make sure that we're not unleashing things that we are going to be remorseful of down the road.
You mentioned Don Norman earlier and his two books. And actually, you reminded me of something that I'd forgotten about, which was functional utility and emotional engagement. I don't think I read that second book that was on emotional engagement. But his more recent book is Design for Humanity, which is how do we do both of those things and design in such a way that we're creating something sustainable for the future. And so you've been involved with the Long Now Foundation. Just because not everybody is going to know what that is, what is that? And what is its mission?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about the Long Now Foundation. And let's make sure to come back to sustainability too, because I'd love to talk to you about this class that I'm teaching right now called View from the Future, and some work we're doing around changing some of our students' perspectives about their agency and creating more sustainable futures. But the Long Now Foundation, I just joined the board, which I'm thrilled about, was started over 25 years ago by Stuart Brand. Some of your listeners may know Stuart Brand because, well, we call him at the D.school, we affectionately call him as Steve Jobs's Steve Jobs. We sometimes reference Steve Jobs for the think different, but Steve Jobs in his famous speech at Stanford University graduation speech references Stuart Brand a number of times. And in fact, quotes him at the end. This is an interesting little tidbit. Many people attribute the famous quote, "Stay hungry, stay foolish," to Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs did not say that. Stuart Brand said that. So he was quoting Stuart Brand. And he did quote him in the speech, but that part gets lost. Anyway, Stuart Brand also created the Whole Earth Catalog, which some of your listeners may know, which was created in 1968. And the opening lines of that catalog is, "We are as gods. We might as well get used to it." And the Whole Earth Catalog was really almost like cultural sensation, a movement that was, as Steve Jobs mentions in his speech, sort of like Google before Google. It was like the Sears catalog of everything. And Stuart's perspective was to try to democratize access to tools to give more people agency, but it was done in such a way that it created a whole cultural movement. And on the Whole Earth Catalog, one of the reasons why it's called that, because Stuart's also responsible for getting the government to release the first picture of Earth from space. And the reason why Stuart was so focused on that was because He felt like if we all could see the whole earth, it would connect our humanity and it would make us care for the earth in different ways. So they sort of essentially launched the modern environmental movement. So Stewart has been on a lifelong journey applied in different ways, including technology. He was at the first hackers conference in the 80s. He has been on a journey to help people think differently about the relationship to creating change and the ability to support surviving civilizations. And the Long Now was created to actually fund another audacious project he had in mind, which was to build a 10,000-year clock. And he partnered with Danny Hillis of Applied Minds, famous engineer, and Brian Eno, who coined the idea of long now civilizations. And they thought that if they built something tangible, concrete, like a 10,000-year clock, that would illuminate people's imaginations to develop a longer time horizon in thinking about their responsibility around supporting thriving civilizations over time. So the Long Now was created as a foundation to support that audacious project. It's actually almost done, which is amazing. But that's not all that they do. They also really create a lot of different programs, including what they call seminars about long-term thinking, these SALT programs that anybody can go and watch to help really expand our thinking about long-term possibilities across really every domain of humanity.
It's very interesting that all these things are coming together to me. I remember Stuart Brand speaking about what it meant to see the Earth from space and how that he felt that was the cultural moment, the most important cultural moment that there's been because it sees the world whole. And also then trying to see time more completely, trying to see not just the whole Earth, but the whole future of Earth. What's interesting to me is that combining that with the idea that the way to get there is incredibly incremental because design is so iterative. It's almost the same question I asked before when I think about it, which is how do you do scenario planning that's longer term and then design, which is so present in first person? And so to think about the whole Earth is not necessarily a first person way of looking at the problem, but then the way to make the whole Earth better is through first person iterative processes.
Well, I would add just one piece of that maybe helps connect those. Again, this is one of my personal points of view about design, is that design can start with an audacious point of view, and it often is most powerful, particularly when you're looking for transformational design, to have a point of view. That point of view may not be incremental. Getting there, learning your way to that may be incremental because that's how you experiment and learn. But Stewart was capable of having super audacious points of view, and then the Whole Earth Catalog was an iterative process to make it happen. But this idea that everyone should have access to tools, big, audacious idea. There was nothing incremental about that because it didn't exist. And I think, Dart, this connects to a foundational philosophy that I have in forming what I do every day, which is to help more people feel like they can have audacious points of view or points of view about the future. I don't want people feeling like the future is happening to them. That is not an agentic stance. Or quoting my good friend Ahmed Best, who is an Afrofuturist, played Jar Jar Binks and now is a Jedi on the Star Wars franchise, among other things. He says, do not let people future all over you. When I ask my students, as I do every opening class, who shapes the future? And they say things to me like, well, who do you think they say? Who do you think they say?
I'd be really interested to know who they think they say. I'm sure that they would identify technology leaders and political leaders.
Yeah. They do. They say Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos and Mark Zuckerberg. And I think that that's probably undeniable that they are future shapers. But I'd like to hear a whole lot more people said on that. I'd like them to be like, I will shape the future. Or even, and this is what I try to do, to again, that shrink that change between like the futures for other people to design all throughout class, among other things, bring up case studies. How is Taylor Swift a futurist? I wrote a whole article about that. Well, she imagined a whole different approach to her concerts. When she would go to a city, she would dramatically increase the economic value of nearly every part of that city. She would bring attention to social impact organizations within those cities. She would galvanize the humanity within the audience members and fans, exchanging friendship bracelets based on nothing. combating so many social challenges, starting with loneliness, starting with connection with each other. So why don't we talk about her that way? Why don't we talk about Dolly Parton that way? Dolly Parton's a futurist. Dolly Parton helped fund the vaccine. She helped overcome people's fears about that vaccine by going on national television to get it done, to invite and use her influence for good, to try to demystify and, again, reduce fears of what it might be like to follow a public health policy to help vaccinate us against this terrible disease. So I'm all about finding those moments and elevating them and learning from them. And I think they're everywhere.
What I like about those examples is that technology provides improved means to doing things. Quote from Thoreau that I recently learned reading Nick Romeo's book, The Alternative. The quote was, "Improved means with unimproved ends will not get us where we want to be," essentially. I actually don't know how that sentence finished in the actual book. But this idea that the technologies are bringing us improved means, but if we don't match them with improved ends, we won't get what we want. Well, you take Stuart Brand. Stuart Brand said, we have a different end in mind here, which is something 10,000 years from now. Taylor Swift said, we have a different end in mind here, which is we're going to grow how the community is thriving. And so this idea of innovation in ends as opposed to innovation in means is really interesting.
Well, think about what's required. It's imagination, curiosity, and observation, a willingness to challenge status quo. And when people ask me, what's your definition of a futurist? I say, look, the willingness to take a longer term horizon, the willingness to look at opportunities from an outside in perspective, not just incremental, but how are things changing and why? The willingness to use bold imagination to really push and stretch thinking from where things feel possible today to where we might want to be. The willingness to live in the ambiguity, knowing that we don't exactly know how we're going to get there, but we're going to try. Look, JFK was a bold futurist, right? We're going to put a man on the moon in the next 10 years, that famous 1962 speech. He didn't know how he was going to do it. And by 10 years, even if he wasn't sadly, tragically assassinated, he would have been out of office, even if he was elected again. So this willingness to be like, I'm going to put out a bold idea that I might not even be in office to take credit for. And he ended up lifting an entire nation with that bold statement. And you end up engaging hundreds of thousands of people of different expertise in order to make it happen. But that's a bold futurist move. So I'm always about noticing when people are brave enough to envision something that doesn't exist today. That's a form of power, takes courage. Listen, here's what I'll also say, Dart. There's a lot of safety in saying no. There's a lot of safety in saying that would never happen. It's hard work to put a big, bold idea. Look, last year, I think we had talked about that some of my projects are wide-ranging, including trying to create more civic futurists, challenging even what democracy could mean. And I don't mean democracy from a technical standpoint, but last year I gathered 125, 150, what I call democracy makers, movers, and multipliers in order to explore more positive civic futures. And people are like, what are you doing? It's under attack. This is not the time, Lisa. This is not the time to put up wallpaper and window. Like, we got to defend. And my perspective was, as a futurist, if we don't create new narratives, new images of the future, of what we want to build, we will always be in defending mode. We had to take time out in order to honor and cultivate stories that would pull us towards a better tomorrow. And we designed that. And I had to, at every step, say to myself, why is this in the Design Institute and not at the law school, right? This was not about trying to tackle gerrymandering or campaign finance reform. Luckily, there's a lot of people doing that. That's not what this was about. This was about igniting our imagination and grounding that in bright spots of today by looking at a wide swath of, getting back to one of your earlier questions, multiple perspectives in order to remind us what we're capable of. I could tell you more about that, but it was magic. It was magic and had real impact.
One of the things that occurred to me while I was reading your work that I'd never thought about before is that a great deal of the uncertainty in our future is driven by changes in technology. And that, to some extent, design is accelerating the speed of change. Why? Because it tests possibilities very rapidly and then it releases successful ones into the world. And so the truth is that it is both the response to rapid change in the world, but it is also causal of rapid change in the world.
That's an interesting provocation. I'm going to think more about that. I think you give technologists more credit than I might, that they are designers. They are putting stuff out in the world. If they're being with the kind of intentionality that I hope designers have, I'm not so sure.
Got it.
And
Yeah,
in fact,
good point.
we need more design because that might actually slow things down. I don't believe in the ready, fire, aim model. The aiming part is the iterative part, is the did you get it right part? Are you honoring the values that you care about? Don't just ship it because you can. And as I mentioned, right now I'm teaching a class at Stanford called View from the Future. Every week we bring in someone who is sitting at the edge of their industry to try to understand how they're pioneering new frontiers, what they're seeing, what their journey was, skills that they recommend our students learn, particularly the ones that are not typically taught in classrooms. And a couple weeks ago, we did one on the future of the metaverse. Kind of interesting because the metaverse has been a disruptive technology that's been around for 30 years, right? Like, no, now, right? No, now Facebook bought Oculus. It's going to take off. Oh, now Facebook's reorging and getting rid of Oculus and all. And we had the founder of an interesting design for XR, extended reality company, join us. From the company's called Shapes XR. She's wonderful. And she's a huge proponent of design and basically kept saying one of the reasons why it is not taken off is because there are not enough designers in the space. The technologists are shipping the technology without really understanding the needs that it might serve in the market. And we also had as our guest, Andrew Schwartz, who is the director of metaverse engineering for Nike, who is a designer, really kind of grew up like first in the 1.0, he was building websites and then user generated exchanges. And now he's working in this extended digital physical connection. How do we take what Nike really sells, which is access to activity, aspirational activity, and explore how we might create value in this digital space? And he, again, it's like, look, if you're not really creating experiences that generate joy and connection for people, which designers know how to do, right? It's not about the technology. So anyway, I'm going to continue to reflect on that observation, but I'm not sure I think when design is done well, it accelerates adoption of the technology because it has the layer that understands how humans will use it in the world. But I think technology for technology's sake may not be the winner.
To some extent, you're tying it back to customer centrism, which is that technologies that are rolled out without that customer centrism are just doomed to failure and other things. And so one of the things I ask every guest, and I've asked hundreds and hundreds of people at the end of each show, is what job do you hire your work to do for you?
What a great question. I think I hire my work for the reason it shifted a little bit. My first response was, and why I feel so privileged to do my work, is I hire my work for my own personal resilience strategy. I love what I do. I get so much joy and energy out of what I do. And all of what I do, whether I'm teaching a class, whether I'm working with leaders, where I'm working on an article that I think will have meaning for others, that will help them see the world differently and their agency differently. When I hear about the impact that it's had, when I get a note from a former student that says, oh my gosh, thank you so much. You believed in me and now I'm having all these opportunities. You saw what I was capable of. Wow, is that going to fill me up for the day? And listen, there's a lot that I can't control. But those choices are literally my personal resilience strategy. And I just feel so, so grateful I have that opportunity. I will also say that relatedly, it fuels my own joy. I am not Pollyanna in thinking we're on a good path right now. We are not. And there's a lot of people out there that are uncomfortable with joy in a time filled with so much pain. To me, joy is the abundance strategy. Joy is the ultimate response to a scarcity mindset that can allow us to be more creative and generative in this moment when we need it most, right? And connected to each other. So lots of reasons why I hire my work for myself, I think. The job that my work is doing for me.
It's interesting because several of the futurists I've spoken with go through a very dark period in their career where they've seen enough of what the future could become. They're almost like how philosophers at some point arrive at skepticism, at just absolute skepticism and they can't dig their way out until they find a philosophy that can get them out. And futurists get to this place somewhere in their career where it looks dire. And so when you say your resilience strategy, it seems like it might be connected to that, which is, look, we are not passive victims of the future. We are active creators of the future.
Yes. And I would say the word that I should have also used is hope. I'm an applied hope kind of person, grounded in the reality of today, but not giving up on tomorrow. That's my main mantra. And you're right, Dart. I will say that I hadn't thought about it that way, but I definitely went through a dark period not too long ago. I have been spending the last 5 years working on a number of civic initiatives, trying to not just respond to what was happening on the threats to democracy, but to unleash, again, this feeling of what we can build together. And it's been a very dark time for lots of reasons, seeing that some of these incredible initiatives and efforts are not enough. And that's hard. That's hard when you are a grounded optimist. That is hard. A big part of what I try to do and model for my students are, again, pulling on these case studies. No, look, this possible, this possible. It felt hard. It felt hard. So, okay, I'm seasoned enough to know, and thanks to the gifts of great psychologists like Martin Seligman, right? That's a temporary moment. That's not going to be my permanent state. That's a temporary moment, which again, futurists are good at understanding temporal timeframes. I had to sort of do what I had to do because I was also not willing to fake it. That's not who I am. For people that work with me, that take my class, they know I show up very authentically. So I was grateful that during that harder moment, I wasn't teaching. So I didn't have to work to feel like I was portraying something that I didn't believe and, return to the things, like I said, that fuel me up, creating connections, building something that didn't exist before, creating opportunities for more people to grow and stretch and then feel like they can go off and do things. Super, super joyful and generative.
One of the things I say occasionally, I learned this from a great consultant, Emily Eason, when our project failed. And she said, change comes in like the tide. And she said, it came in higher this time, and it will come in higher next time. And if you just look at it receding in the moment, you'll miss the tide. You won't see the tide. You may have already said it, but what does your job cost you? What does your work cost you?
Well, it's funny. I'm at a place in my career where I'm lucky enough to take on projects that have deep personal meaning to me. It's a privilege and a gift. A lot of times that means I'm doing things pro bono. So there are actual times when I think, like much of the civics work I've been working on, time and time again, late hours, big hustle, no money. In fact, the opposite, right? I personally was funding it, supporting it. Sometimes I'm one of these weird people, Dart, where I don't know if there's a name for it. Maybe ChatGPT will find out. But I get songs in my head during certain moments to capture how I'm feeling. And so every now and again, I get the Donna Summer version, the she works hard for the money, but I think like she works hard for no money. Again, I'm lucky in that I get to be choiceful about the projects, that they don't all have to maximize income. That is a great, great privilege and choice. But I think about that. I have made intentional choices in my career to not build out a training program off the book, to not maximize every speaking engagement, to not, whatever, because I wanted to create and protect space for doing more meaningful things that I thought were aligned with my values.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Same. I'll tell you how this all plays into all the discussions that we've had before, is that I've asked this question of so many people, and I've gotten so many diverse answers to the point where, especially in combination, when you ask people what they hire their job to do for them, the answer is everybody hires their job to do something unique for them. There are ways in which it's the ultimate mass customization problem or opportunity, I would say. And today you gave me an example of a mass customization solution that made that sort of thing look feasible when you talked about the GNC story. And so thank you for that. I really appreciate you coming on the show today. I feel like I'm walking away, I take notes while I do this, and a lot of the notes are just, what am I going to ask next? But a lot of my notes today was, don't forget, that this thing is true. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. What a fun conversation. Thank you for allowing it the spaciousness to have the time, the thoughtfulness of the questions, the deep care for this work that just is so clear in your approach and your invitation. for so many of us to come in and learn together. So I really appreciate it.
How can people learn more about you and your work?
Well, thank you for asking. I'm a pretty avid LinkedIn poster these days. That's my best place to get the most up to date. I often share reflections from my class, other things that I see people write that are connected that can elevate. So definitely find me, Lisa K. Solomon, on LinkedIn. I have a course called Leader as Futurist on LinkedIn that they can take. I think I've gotten pretty good reviews. We're north of maybe certainly 100,000 learners at this point. So encourage people to do that. And very soon I have a new website coming out. And the URL will be my name.
So your whole name, Lisa K. Solomon?
Lisa K. Solomon, all spelled
.com.
out. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Oh, thanks so much.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio, for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.